In the misty mountains of Appalachia, they say a word can be sharper than any blade, and a woman's pride can be a poison more potent than any rattlesnake's venom. They tell a story of a young man lying on his deathbed, not from fever or from battle, but from love. And they whisper the name of the woman who put him there with a single cruel sentence. Her name was Barbara Allen. Most folks have heard the song, a sad little tune about a hard-hearted girl. But here, in the isolated hollows, that song became more than music. It became a legend of a heart so cold it could freeze a man's soul. It raises a question that still echoes in these hills. Can a person truly be killed by a word? Today, we separate the ballad from the chilling folklore it spawned, to look into the icy heart of Barbara Allen and ask the one question the mountains have been asking for centuries. Was she a monster, or the most tragic victim of them all? You have to understand what life was like back then, in those hidden pockets of the Appalachians. It was a world carved out of the wilderness by sheer grit and stubbornness. Life wasn't measured in the turning of pages on a calendar, but in the rhythm of the seasons, the spring thaw that swelled the creeks, the long hot summers of planting and tending, the autumn harvest that decided who would eat well and who would go hungry through the biting winter. The mountains weren't just a backdrop, they were a living entity, providing everything you needed, but also capable of taking it all away in a heartbeat with a flash flood or a sudden blizzard. In the heart of one such settlement lived a young man they called Sweet William. The name wasn't just a convenience, it was a description. He was the kind of man who was first to help a neighbor raise a barn and the last to leave a campfire. He had a strength that came from working the hard soil and a laugh that could cut through the thickest mountain fog. He was the future, the promise of another generation surviving and thriving in this unforgiving land. Everyone loved him because he was the best of them, a reflection of the warmth and community that was the only real shield against the cold and the dark. And then there was Barbara Allen. If William was the warm hearth of the community, she was the frost on the window pane. She possessed a beauty that was almost painful to look at, sharp and perfect, like a shard of ice. But it was a remote beauty. She lived with her mother in a small cabin, keeping to herself, her silence often mistaken for arrogance. The other girls whispered about her pride, and the young men who tried to court her came away feeling as if they'd tried to warm their hands on a marble statue. She was a mystery, an outsider in a community where there were no secrets. Yet, as it so often happens, the fire was drawn to the frost. William saw something in Barbara that no one else did. Not coldness, but a guarded sorrow, a strength that had hardened into a shield. And she, in turn, saw in his open-hearted nature a warmth she'd never known. Their courtship wasn't one of public pronouncements, but of stolen glances across the clearing during a Sunday service, of a wildflower left on her doorstep, of two people from different worlds circling each other like the sun and the moon. For a brief, hopeful season, it seemed that William's warmth might just be enough to melt her icy heart. But this world was as fragile as it was harsh. It was held together by unwritten laws of respect, honor, and pride. A person's reputation was their most valuable possession, more precious than land or livestock. And in a place where life was a constant struggle, a wounded pride could fester like a snakebite, turning the promise of love into the certainty of a grave. The community, watching the two lovers, held its breath, sensing that this was a story that could only end in one of two ways, with a wedding or with a tragedy that would be whispered around their fireplaces for 100 years to come. The turning point, the moment the future split into what could have been and what was, didn't happen in a dark forest or with the flash of a knife. It happened in a place of celebration. The harvest had been good, and the community gathered in the largest clearing, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat, wood smoke, and the sweet, sharp scent of homemade apple cider. Fiddles were playing, people were laughing, and for a little while, The harshness of mountain life was forgotten. At the center of it all, of course, was sweet William. He was in his element, surrounded by friends, his voice booming over the music. Flushed with cider and the simple joy of the evening, he raised his wooden cup. "A toast!" he shouted, a wide grin on his face. "A toast to the beauties of this valley who make the work worthwhile and the winters warm." Men cheered, and the women, both young and old, smiled at the compliment. It was a simple, clumsy, heartfelt gesture from a young man who loved his home and the people in it. But in a shadowed corner, one pair of eyes didn't smile. Barbara Allen had watched him all evening, a rare warmth in her own heart. She saw him as hers, a private treasure. And in that moment, his toast felt like a betrayal. He hadn't toasted her. He had thrown her into the common lot with every other woman there. To his mind, it was a harmless, all-encompassing compliment. To her proud and guarded heart, it was a public declaration that she was nothing special to him at all. It was a careless flick of the wrist that to her felt like a slap across the face. She didn't scream or cry. Her pain was a cold, quiet thing. The light in her eyes simply went out, replaced by a glacial hardness. Without a word, she stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked out of the clearing, vanishing into the night. Her departure was so silent that at first only a few noticed. But a chill followed in her wake, and soon the whispers started. William, seeing her empty place, felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The laughter died on his lips. He followed her, of course. He went to her cabin that night and the next day, but the door remained barred. He sent friends to plead his case, but they returned with shaken heads, speaking of a coldness they had never seen in a living soul. The community watched as a wall of silent, unforgiving pride rose between the two lovers. William's careless words had been the spark, but Barbara's wounded heart was the tinder. A fire had been lit, a slow, consuming blaze that wouldn't be put out with apologies. It was a fire that would demand a sacrifice. William's life wasn't being taken by disease. It was draining away from a wound no doctor could see, a sickness of the soul. His servants, loyal and terrified, saw their master fading like the last embers of a fire. In desperation, they went to the one person who held the cure or the final poison. They found Barbara Allen at her cabin, and their message was a raw plea. "Our Lord is dying, and he is calling for the one named Barbara Allen." There was no command in their voice, only a prayer. She rose slowly, so slowly you'd think time itself was wading through molasses. Every step she took from her cabin to his bedside was deliberate, a leisurely stroll towards a man's last moments. When she finally entered his room, the servant standing helplessly by the door felt a sudden chill, a damp cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was as if she had brought the dead of winter into that small, suffocating space with her. William, pale as a death shroud, his voice a dry whisper, turned his face from the pillow. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for a single drop of mercy. "I am sick, and very, very low," he rasped. "And it's all for the love of you, Barbara Allen." It was his last gamble, his entire being laid bare, hoping to find a flicker of the woman he loved beneath the ice. But the woman who stood over him was not a lover. She was a judge. Her face was a mask of cold indifference. She looked down at the dying man, not with pity, but with a chilling clarity. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "I remember," she said, each word a perfectly formed drop of venom. "There, in the tavern of the city, when the wine was pouring like a river, you drank to the health of all the beauties, and you neglected me, Barbara Allen." Those words weren't a memory. They were a sentence. They were the final killing blow. The servants watched as the last spark of hope in William's eyes was extinguished. It wasn't a flicker. It was a snuffing out, as sudden and complete as a candle plunged into water. No weapon was raised, no blood was shed, but everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed an execution. William said nothing more. He simply took a shallow breath, and with the last of his strength, he turned his face to the cold, unforgiving wall. It was an act of final surrender. He was turning his back not just on her, but on the world itself, a world where the woman he loved had chosen her pride over his life. A moment later, a profound stillness fell upon the room, a silence deeper and more terrible than any scream. Sweet William was gone. Barbara Allen turned and walked out of that room without a backward glance. She left behind a profound silence, a dead man, and the shattered servants who had just witnessed a soul being extinguished by sheer cruelty. She stepped out into the crisp mountain air, her head held high, the victor in a war only she had been fighting. Her pride was satisfied. Her grievance was avenged. She had won. For the first few hundred yards, that cold satisfaction was a shield, protecting her from the truth of what she had done. But she had not gone a mile, just as the path began to wind back towards her own lonely cabin, when a new sound reached her. It was a sound that cut through the rustling leaves and the sighing of the wind. A single, mournful toll of a funeral bell, echoing from the small church in the valley. Dong. It was a sound of finality, a sound of fact. Sweet William was dead. The bell was telling the mountains the news, and that sound pierced her icy armor. The second toll followed the first, and with each resonant peal, a crack appeared in the frozen wall around her heart. It was no longer the sound of her victory, it was the sound of her damnation. The ballad says that the bell seemed to cry out her own name on the wind, a mournful accusation. Hard-hearted Barbara Allen. The pride, the anger, the memory of that silly toast in the tavern, it all evaporated, leaving behind a horrifying, empty void. The realization struck her with the physical force of a blow. The man she loved was in the ground because of her. She had traded his life for a moment of bitter triumph, and the bargain was a fool's one. Her heart, which could not be melted by his love, was now shattered by the sound of his death knell. The community would hear that bell too. The servant's story would spread from cabin to cabin, whispered over cook fires and spinning wheels. There would be no trial, no judge or jury. Her verdict was already being delivered by the hushed, horrified voices of her neighbors. She was no longer just the proud girl. She was the cruel woman, the one who had killed Sweet William with nothing but a handful of cold, unforgiving words. There was no trial held in a courthouse for Barbara Allen. There was no judge in a black robe, no jury of 12 good men and true. What law had she broken? There is no statute against having a heart of stone, no crime on the books for killing a man with a memory and 5 cruel words. The law of men, with its ink and paper, was silent. It had no language to describe what had happened in that death room. But in the mountains, there is another kind of justice, an older and more immediate law. And Barbara Allen's trial had already begun. The courtroom was every cabin, every clearing, every fireside in the valley. The servants who had stood helpless at William's bedside were the sole witnesses, and their testimony, spoken in hushed, horrified tones, was the only evidence needed. The story spread faster than a forest fire, a tale of love turned to poison, of a pride so monstrous it could watch a man die and feel nothing. The community, which had once whispered about her coldness, now spoke of it as a fact, an unnatural blight on the world. The verdict was unanimous. She was guilty. But Barbara wasn't listening to them. She was a prisoner in a different kind of court, the one held in the echoing silence of her own soul. The funeral bell had been the prosecution's opening statement, and it had shattered her every defense. As she ran home, stumbling through the woods, she wasn't fleeing justice. She was rushing to accept her sentence. When she burst through the door of her mother's cabin, her face was a mask of terror and grief. She was no longer a cold-hearted killer. She was a condemned woman. Her confession was not a plea for mercy, but a final, desperate command. She cried out to her mother, the words tumbling from her in a torrent of unbearable guilt. "Mom, Mom, make my bed, make it softly and long. My darling died for me today, and I will die for him tomorrow." In that moment, she was both the accused and the executioner. She understood the ancient law of the mountains: a heart for a heart, a life for a life. Her own pride had demanded William's life as payment, and now her conscience, awakened too late, demanded hers in return. And so the final verdict was delivered, not by the community, who would soon change their condemnation to a sad, shaking pity, but by Barbara Allen herself. She died the next day, not of fever or sickness, but of a broken heart, the very ailment she had inflicted upon her lover. Was it justice? Perhaps it was something more profound. It was a perfect, terrible symmetry. The law of men could never have balanced the scales so precisely. The mountains had rendered their own judgment, leaving 2 fresh graves as a permanent warning that a heart closed to forgiveness is a tomb waiting to be filled. And so they buried them in the old churchyard, side by side. He, the victim of a love too strong, and she, the victim of a pride that had turned to poison. In any other story, that would be the end. 2 graves on a lonely hillside, slowly being reclaimed by the wild grass and the passage of time. But in Appalachia, some stories refuse to stay buried in the ground. They grow. Out of Sweet William's grave, the old-timers say, there grew a rose. It wasn't just any rose, but one with petals so deep and red they looked like drops of blood, a symbol of the true and passionate love he'd held in his heart. And from Barbara Allen's grave, there grew a briar, its vines thorny and grasping, a testament to the sharp, tangled pride that had protected and ultimately destroyed her. They grew, reaching up towards the Appalachian sun as if pulled by some unseen force. The rose climbed the old stone wall of the churchyard, and the briar followed. Higher and higher they went, until at the very peak of the wall they met. And there, under the watchful eyes of the mountains, the soft red rose and the thorny green briar intertwined. They wove themselves together into what the ballad calls a true lover's knot, a symbol of forgiveness, a sign that the love that was denied in life had finally found its union in death. Now, you can't go to a specific place in Kentucky or North Carolina and find a headstone that reads Barbara Allen. Her grave is not a place on a map. The real marker isn't made of stone, it's made of music. The ballad itself is the echo. It survived the long ocean voyage from Scotland, and in the isolated hollows of Appalachia, it found its true home. It was passed down like an heirloom, from a grandmother's cracked voice to a child listening on a porch swing, a lesson and a lullaby all in one. The story became a part of the people, and that is what remains today. The traces are not in archives or history books, but in the culture itself. It's in the melancholy bend of a fiddle string, in the lyrics sung by 1,000 different voices over hundreds of years. The mountains do remember, and though most people have forgotten the fine details, the legend of the rose and the briar still hangs in the air of every old, overgrown cemetery, a ghostly reminder that love and pride are 2 powerful vines that, once tangled, can never truly be separated. So we come back to the question that has haunted this story from the start, a question that the wind still whispers in the high mountain passes. Was Barbara Allen a monster, or was she a victim? The truth, like most truths in these mountains, is not a simple thing. In that death room, standing over the man who loved her, she was a monster. She wielded her wounded pride like a weapon and dealt a killing blow. But in the moments that followed, when the sound of a funeral bell shattered her soul, she became the story's final, most tragic victim, a prisoner of a pride she could no longer live with. This is the eternal lesson encoded in the ballad of Barbara Allen, the reason it has survived for centuries while grander tales have turned to dust. It's a story that warns us that a heart shielded by pride is the most fragile heart of all. It teaches us that forgiveness is not a gift we give to others, but a key to our own freedom. The rose and the briar are not just a fanciful ending, they are the story's true moral. They tell us that even after a tragedy born of bitterness and spite, redemption is possible, that two souls torn apart by life can find their way back to each other in the end. This is more than just a ghost story or a sad old song. It is a piece of Appalachia's soul. It is a testament to the people who lived and died by a code of honor that could be both their greatest strength and their most fatal flaw. And even today, if you find yourself deep in the mountains when the fog is rolling in and the world grows quiet, you can almost hear it. A sad, distant melody on the wind and the mournful toll of a bell, forever crying out a warning and a lament. Poor Barbara Allen.